Hello, and welcome to another installment of the ARC Racing Tech videos. Again, my name is Jody. I am the engine builder and one of the techs here at ARC Racing. The purpose of this video is to focus on the billet connecting rods that we manufacture for the overhead valve engines used in racing today. We're going to show you the proper procedures on installing your bearings, torquing your bolts, and checking for oil clearances using two different methods, plastigage and micrometers. So let's get started. When you receive your billet connecting rod, it'll come in this well labeled box telling you the length of the rod, the engine it's for, and the part number. Inside the box, of course, you'll find the bearing inserts, the connecting rod with the bolts already installed, and these instructions. Now the instructions will tell you anything and everything you need to know to properly install your billet connecting rod into your engine. Everything from the tools you'll need, cleaning and inspecting the rod when you get it, installing the bearings, proper bolt torque, the poundage, the proper lube to use on them. It gives you measurements to check your oil clearances with if you're using inside and outside micrometers. It also has a brief description on how to check your oil clearances with plastigage. Now plastigage is what a lot of people use to check clearances with. This is available at most any auto parts store. If they don't have it in stock, they can order it for you. But you need to make sure that you get the measurement sizes from at least 2 to 6 thousandths of an inch, because the measurements that you're looking to achieve here is between 2.5 and 3.5 thousandths of an inch. The tools other than that you'll need that might be kind of hard to find is the 12-point quarter-inch socket that we use to tighten the bolts with. Again, these can be found at any auto parts store. I found this one at Lowe's. I got them at Home Depot. Most any place has got them or can get them. You'll need a quarter-inch torque wrench. 3/8 is fine to use, which is what I use. You can get these little adapters any auto parts store also, but if you use a 3/8 torque wrench, make sure that it is in inch pounds, not in foot pounds. A foot pounds torque wrench is okay to use. The inch pounds specific torque wrench is much more accurate, and it's also more compact to be able to get up into the engine to tighten your bolts. And you got a lot of tight areas right there, so you need something compact. But I've used this one on every engine we built, and I have zero problems tightening down bolts. Okay, what I'm going to show you now is how to install the bearings in the connecting rod and to check your oil clearance between the rod and the crank by using the plastigage. Now, as I told you earlier, these rod bolts were already installed when you got the connecting rod, and they're torqued to 150 inch-pounds. And they're done so for a reason. It's because this connecting rod is made in two different parts. You have the cap and you have the beam. We make the caps and then we make the beams. Once the machining process is so far along on both of the products, they are mated together, the bolts are installed and torqued to 150 inch-pounds, and then they finish the machining process on the rod. What that does is it mates this cap to this rod, meaning you cannot take the cap off of this 6270 connecting rod and install it on another 6270 connecting rod. They may look like they'll fit, they may feel like they'll fit, but more than likely what's going to happen is the bearings are not going to line up properly, and it's going to cause rod failure. Now, to take these bolts out, like I said, they're 150 inch-pounds. Easy way to do it, simple shop rag. Wrap it around the wrist pin area of the rod and install it in a vise. If you notice here, I do have soft jaws on this vise. It is perfectly fine to use the metal jaw clamps on this rod. That's why you wrap the rag around it, to prevent any damage. I mean, you're not trying to squeeze it and change its shape. You're just trying to hold it in place to loosen the bolts. Take your 12-point quarter-inch socket and pop them loose. Now, one thing to remember when removing these bolts is they do have a washer on them, and the washer is indexed, meaning it can only go one direction. If you look at it, one side has a bevel, the other side is flat. The beveled side always goes toward the rod bolt. The flat side always goes toward the connecting rod. That's important to remember when you go to reinstall the cap, is to make sure that the washers are the correct way. Now, at this point, you can take the connecting rod and clean it. You can use warm soapy water, get down in all the holes really good, scrub it really good, and use compressed air to dry it. The compressed air will blow out any debris that may be caught up in the rod from shipping or handling, or whatever reason it may be in there. These here are your rod bearings. Now, they're not indexed top or bottom. It doesn't matter which one goes where. One thing you may notice on these bearings, if you see right there, some of it's shiny, then it gets kind of dull. That's nothing more than the coating from where we packaged up the bearing. You see that fits a thumb perfectly right there. That's where we touch it, and it turns dark. It harms nothing. It will cause nothing. You can take a rag most of the time and kind of buff it out. Now, when installing the bearings into the rod, one thing you'll notice in the rod is this little cutout area right here. That matches the little tang on the bearing. You just simply line those two up and push it down in. And what you want to do is just try to line it up flush as you can for now. Same thing with the cap. It has the cutout and the tab. And you're just trying to get it halfway straight. Now, this is where a lot of people get confused right here on how the cap goes back on the rod. An easy way to remember that: all of the connecting rods for the Honda Clone Predator type engines will have 3 holes on one side. You'll have the original oiling hole that's the same hole as the OEM rod. You'll have the hole where the rod bolt comes through, and our forced oil dipper, which is what scoops the oil up and squirts it up into the bearing to get extra lubrication. Those 3 holes line up on the connecting rod. That's the only way this cap is designed to go on. There is no holes on this side. So if you only got 2 holes on one side, that means it's wrong. And that's also how you index the rod to go into the engine. You want your 3 holes to face the camshaft. That's the only way the cap can go on. That's the only way the rod can go into the engine. Okay, now we've got our bearings installed and we're ready to check our oil clearances using our plastigage. A plastigage is exactly what it sounds like. It is a thin strip of plastic. You break off a small piece and put it between the bearing and the crankshaft, and then you torque the bolts down, and that pulls everything in together, and it actually squishes the plastigage and it spreads out like putty. And then you remove the cap and you use these little gauges here on the paper to tell you exactly how much clearance is in between the bearing and the crankshaft. This little area right here, it will be 2 thousandths, 3 thousandths, 4, 5, 6. The more it spreads, the less room is in there for oil clearances. So what I'm going to do is show you the right way and the wrong way to use this plastigage. A lot of people put the piston on the rod, put the rod in the engine, and try to plastigage inside the engine. Well, you don't have a lot of room in there, and this stuff is very sensitive as far as how it spreads, to get proper measurements. And when you're in here with a torque wrench trying to torque a rod down, you get crankshaft movement. I mean, that's not a lot, but that little bit right there can skew the results enough to make your measurements flawed. You'll have too much or too little clearance, and you'll think it's right because of the the measurements on here may say it's right, but you may have too much or too little because of all the movement you have in here. Now what I do, I measure everything outside of the engine. Once again, take your trusty old shop rag, wrap her up, and you want to try to wrap it as low as possible because we're going to put it in the vise with the rod angling out so that it supports the crankshaft. You don't want the crankshaft touching anything. Alright, and then you simply take a piece of your plastigage. I've got a piece right here already out. You don't need a lot, you just need a little bit. That right there is enough. And some people tell you need to lay it crossways, some people say horizontal. I don't really care, just put it up there so that it don't fall off. Take your rod cap, the bearings are already in it. Make sure that we line the cap up right. Remember your 3 holes. Place the cap on it. Then you're going to install your bolts. Make sure your washers are turned the right way, bevel to the bolt. I've already pre-lubed these bolts with just some standard motor oil. You always need to lube your bolts every time you torque them. That helps the bolt grip like it needs to and stretch like it needs to. That's what holds the bolt tight, is the stretch. You do not need Loctite or any other type of adhesive on these bolts. If they're lubed properly and they're torqued properly, they will stay tight. That's what the stretch of the bolt acts like a spring, and it keeps it tight. Okay, everything's lined up good. 12-point 1/4 inch. And if you look at the instructions, it gives you instructions on how to torque the bolts and in what alternates. You want to start around 60 inch-pounds. Set our torque wrench at 60, and you'll want to run the bolts down a little at a time till you feel them snug up, alternating back and forth. Got the first click, second. Alright, and you go up in 20-pound increments. Now you're seeing the rod move a little bit, but the rod itself is not flexing. That is just it moving inside the towel there. That's all that is. Alright, go to 100. Oh, too far. Okay, now we'll go to 120. And you want to go all the way to 150 inch-pounds in 20-pound increments. And once you get to 150, which I went ahead and went to 150 for time restraints. I don't get paid by the hour to do this like I do other things. I'm on my time right now. Okay, we're at 150 inch-pounds, and you want to back the bolts back off. I've always been told never use a torque wrench in reverse. They're only made to torque in one direction. So just get you a small ratchet and just loosen them up a little bit. You ain't got to go too far with it, just loosen them up. Now I usually start back at 100 pounds after I loosen it up. once again, just ease them down. Alright, now we go to 120. I'm going to go to 150. It ain't necessary that you got to go exactly 20. I mean, you can go 25, you can go 30, just as long as you go up in equal increments. Now I'm going to go to 170. Little at a time. What you're feeling now, a lot of people freak out in this time right here because they think the bolts are really stretching because it hasn't clicked. What's happening now is the bearing is actually seating in the rod. I always hit them twice. Okay. Like I say, the last few pounds of the torque, it feels like something's fixing to break, or it feels like something's stretching or moving. Well, that's exactly what's happening. The bolt itself is stretching. That's what's locking the bolt down. The bearings are seating into the rod because the bearings themselves are actually a little bit bigger than the inside of the rod. They're shaped a little different, so you have to get them to proper torque specs to crush them down so that they contour to the shape of the rod. Everything seats in good, the bearings stretch and become big springs, and that's what holds them tight. After you get everything tight, you want to let it sit there for a second or two, not too long, and remove your bolts. And what this does is that plastic gauge is in there, and it's squishing it in between the bearing and the crank and spreading it out like putty. Now I will go ahead and warn you that this plastic gauge I'm using is about 10 years old. This is the first time I've plastic gauged in probably 10 years. I use inside and outside micrometers, so this stuff may look a little funnier than it's supposed to. Watch our washer there. Be very careful taking everything apart. You don't want any side to side movement. Alright, you see what the plastic gauge done? It looks like putty. It's spread out. It crushed it in between the bearing and the crank like it's supposed to. Now you take your gauges here and you look at how much it spread. Okay, we're a little wider than 3, not quite 2. So I say we're right around 2.5, right where we need to be. Now, this is not an exact way to do it. This is just a way that people can set their oil clearances that do not have these expensive type tools. And what I'm going to do now is show you how to measure with the inside and outside micrometers. Okay, now I'm going to give you a quick rundown on how to check your oil clearance using inside and outside micrometers. The first thing you need to do is find your instruction sheet. Open it up to section 2, and there you'll find what the crankshaft journal should measure. This is the crank journal. This is the part you're measuring. This is where the rod rides. And this is for a Honda clone. All the instructions will have the proper crank measurements right here that you need. And for the Honda clone, it's 1 inch 180 thousandths, plus or minus a half a thousandths. You need to make sure that the crank is good and clean. And today I'm using a 1 to 2 inch micrometer. Now the only areas you need to worry about measuring on this is top to bottom and side to side. If those measurements are good, then the crank is good. Take your time doing this. Don't want to get in a hurry and mess up. Alright, that is about 1/10 over where it needs to be. Just over 1 inch 180 thousandths, which is normal. I see these cranks a little on the big side more than I do the small side, which is good because you're able to polish the shaft and get your clearance exactly where you want it. And that side is also about 1/10 over 1 inch, 180 thousandths. And that means the crankshaft's good and round. It's a little on the big side, but according to our plastigage we done earlier, it showed about 2.5 thousandths clearance, which is right where you need to be. Now we're going to measure the inside of a rod. The bearings have already been installed, and we're going to have to put the bolts back in them and torque it back down to 170 inch-pounds. Always make sure the washers are turned the correct way. Now these bolts again have already been pre-lubed. We get our trusty shop rag here, roll it back up, put it back in the vise so that we can torque it back down to our 170 inch-pounds. Now since these bearings are already installed and have been seated, we don't really have to go back through the torque routine we did at first from 160 to 150 and then back it down. You can start it right around 100 pounds since the bearings are already seated, and go to 170 through increments. We're going to start at 100. Got to have the socket on there first, Jody. Get in the game, brother. Alright, that's 100. I'm going to go to 120. Now this thing should tighten right on down. You shouldn't feel as much of the stretching and seating as you did before. That usually only happens one time. Once the bearing is seated in the rod, everything should tighten right down like it should. Okay, now we're going to 170. Yeah, see how quick that happened? Went right down like it should. I always double tap. Okay, now take our rod and we're going to use our dial bore gauge here to measure the inside of the rod. And this dial bore gauge is zeroed out at 1 inch, 180 thousandths. And one thing you want to do is make sure of when using the dial bore gauge is that you stay away from the oiling holes in the rod. To give you some really funky measurements. Alright, so what we do is we just run it down the rod. Get everything where it needs to be. And that's showing 2 thousandths bigger. So we zeroed out on 1 inch, 180, and we're showing 2 thousandths bigger, which is 1 inch, 182 thousandths. Meaning that this connecting rod has 2 thousandths oil clearance on it right now. So you see a little bit of variance between the plastic gauge and the actual micrometers. This is why I like using micrometers. They're a lot more accurate. Now I know that I'm about 1/2 thousandths tight on my clearances, so I can take the crankshaft in there, put it in the crankshaft polisher, and polish it about 1/2 thousandths. And you don't necessarily have to have a crank polisher to polish a shaft. I mean, for years and years before I come to this wonderful company, I would stick them in a vise and take my emery cloth and run around it, you know, making sure that I'm catching all the sides good. I go really slow. I'd hit it with the rough side. I'd take a measurement and see where I'm at, and then I would flip it over to the smooth side and smooth it out. So you don't need all these fancy tools to build fancy engines. You just got to be creative sometimes. So that's kind of in a nutshell on how we find our clearances with connecting rods. Hope this video was helpful. If you have any further questions or concerns, you can call us on our 800 number at 800-521-3560, or hit us up on Facebook and let us know what you think. Thank you.